Hey guys, this is Scott at phasingplayer.com. I am bringing you today the next part of my Matt Eklund interview. In it, we talk about Pax Porfiriana, End Zone, maybe kind of unknown Eklund title, and Pax Renaissance. So enjoy. Really changes the face of sort of a niche anyway. Pax Porfiriana is the next thing, and we talked about it before. And that took the Lords model, Lords of the Sierra Madre specifically, which I've heard a lot of people, I've read some kind of older reviews of Lords of the Sierra Madre that are very, very positive on it. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was a giant commercial success, right? Sort of was a niche of a niche of a niche.
As I may have intimated earlier, Lords of the Sierra Madre second edition almost destroyed Sierra Madre games. And it was, I'm sure it was very hard. I'm sure it was very hard for Phil, and as is tough. It was not a good partnership, and it was not a great or well received game in the form that ended up being published.
Mm-hmm.
But Lords of the Sierra Madre was absolutely one of my favorite games growing up. And anyone who's listening to this who's not familiar with the general Lords concept, because I don't know if Lords really exist. I mean, there are certainly people out there who still play Lords games, but they're going to be few and far between. But the general idea of a Lords game is that you represent some particular mover and shaker within a particular confined time period. And every turn, a new card is drawn, and everyone sort of bids on it. You auction off cards every turn, and you then try to leverage your way to whatever the victory conditions are, which in Lords games are almost always money. So these are finance games. You're supposed to make the most money and win. In Lords of the Sierra Madre, the goal is basically to play as foreign hacendados, investors coming in from outside of Mexico, and make as much money through whatever means necessary as possible, cash money, because then the revolution's going to hit and they're going to nationalize everything and take any money that's left in Mexico. So you're really trying to pillage the country and get out with as much as you can in Lords of the Sierra Madre. It's a great game. You're bribing all sorts of interesting units and parties, and there's power ploys and railroads, and things go wrong and things go right, and whatever partnerships here, there, and everywhere. It was an extreme negotiation game. It was an extreme economic game, and a game I absolutely loved, and I played an epic shit ton of Lords of the Sierra Madre as a kid. However, by the time I was looking at Jim Goot's inspiration, which was to take this old Lords game, which is a failure, and adapt it to some of the new, more popular, more interesting, more I don't know, with little cubes and more intricate mechanics that interlock with each other, rather than just being draw a card free for all, draw a card free for all, draw a card free for all, which is probably Mexico in the late 1800s. I mean, let's not be the free for all, but to adopt that at a very early point, I decided to make the game political, or at least have the possibility of a political outcome.
And this is Pax Porfiriana.
This is Pax Porfiriana, and so the game is has many of the same things. You're a foreign hacendado. You get a certain amount of money, and you're doing things, but it isn't the amount of money that you have at the end of the game, unless things have gone really wrong. It isn't about the amount of money that'll win at the end of the game. Instead, you're trying to depose Porfirio Diaz or be named his successor. And there's a million interesting ways that you can do that. And in reality, there were a million attempts. There were guys coming out of the woodwork with crazy ideas on how to get this thing accomplished. And there were revolutions and counter revolutions and counter revolutions. it was just a really interesting time period that I had already grown up learning about through Burros and Banditos and Lords of the Sierra Madre. A lot of the historical research had already been done. I mean, Phil already had, a bunch of interesting cards and ideas that I was able to heavily mine for mine, but I was able to read more modern texts and add some of the more nuanced political things into the game. And so the game, I made the game. It had hundreds of unique cards. It was a competition to try to either be loyal to Diaz or overthrow Diaz in sort of a junta-like competition. The first design only had 2 colors of victory points. But all the other stuff, all the other actions, from speculation to land buying and all these other interactions, using cubes to represent income streams, was Jim Goot's idea. I stole that directly from his early efforts. But all the other card exchanges and things like that were pretty much done when Phil said, "Hey, I need a game this year. I don't have a game this year. Do you have anything?" And I sent him the game. He added a third color, which was white, and in just classic Sierra Madre games cost-cutting methods, the cards were going to be full color on one side but black and white on the other. And so having one of the victory colors be white allowed us to place points on some of the double-sided cards that did that. So, for example, little known fact, there's 2 common cards in the game, public cards, which were later added for balance reasons, and there's 2 of them are white. And people point to that as being some like genius, part of our design process to bump up the command victory, which we intentionally left a little bit light-handed in the game. But the reality is that we could only put command on the other side of both of those cards because they were black and white on those sides. Couldn't put any other colors on those.
Hey man, those sort of limitations are what breed creativity.
It worked out. Phil added the white, which had to do with military overthrow or red flag rebellion, seceding from Mexico, which was a remarkably common occurrence in Mexico. And one of the states would just say, "I'm not part of Mexico anymore," and then the Mexican army would come and we'd have a big fight, and then they'd be part of Mexico again. Later we added the blue. We added, when we put in the U.S. intervention regime, and all the regimes had already gone in. I had depression as a regime, and Phil pulled that out and made it a separately tracked thing. And he got rid of some of the mine stuff, distinguishing copper and gold. But other than that, I mean, the game was pretty much done when we put it out. Phil put my favorite card in the game, which is Teddy Roosevelt, in the game. I thought that was spectacular.
So you more or less delivered an almost ready to go game then to Phil, and you got tweaked a little bit, and then that's what we have now. So you're largely responsible then for the PAX system that's in play.
I would 100% say that I was the lead designer on Pax Porfiriana, and that the game, there was development work done with the game that I was involved with afterwards, but and the game wouldn't exist at all without Jim Goot, who came up with the whole idea. If you want to give credit for PAX, the PAX system or PAX concept to someone, you should give it to Jim Goot. He's the one who actually came up with the inspiration to try to convert some of Phil's old behemoths into more palatable card games. I would give that credit to Jim, but there were certain mechanisms like the marketplace. I always liked the auctions of old, but they took forever, and so building a free floating auction system into the game by having cards show up that cost more on one end than the other, Pax Porfiriana was not the first game to do that, but I was enthusiastic about adopting that and having players interact with the marketplace directly, not just by buying cards, but also by speculating on cards. That certainly became, I think, a big part of what later became the other PAX games. And Pax Porfiriana is a game that it's just another situation where I designed a game. I didn't feel like there was that stuff out there. I didn't feel like you were going to find a game. I thought it was way too obtuse and way too obscure to find commercial success. I was not expecting it to do well. I was not expecting it to do well at all.
Well,
Lords of the Sierra Madre had already failed.
It's become like almost the signature of Sierra Madre games, I think. Not just Porfiriana, but the PAX series in general. Everyone I've talked to that is like loosely familiar with Sierra Madre always mentions a PAX game. Most recently, it's been Premier, but Renaissance also gets a lot of comments, right? So,
sure.
I'd say for better or for worse, probably for better. But would you say that Pax Porfiriana like really rocketed Sierra Madre into kind of the company that it is now?
No. I would not. I think High Frontier, of the projects that I think High Frontier is that, if you were to ask me what's the defining product of Sierra Madre games, I'd say High Frontier by a mile, by 10 miles, by 100 miles. I think High Frontier represents what Sierra Madre games is about a lot more than Pax Porfiriana, which, I mean, is largely inspired and is a retooled Lords game, in some ways. I would say it's High Frontier.
Okay.
If you made me choose, I'd choose High Frontier.
Okay. Was Pax Porfiriana always intended to be the first in a series, or did it quickly become something where you're like, oh, we can turn this into a series?
Oh, no, I always held the door open for a series, and it's because originally the game was named Pax Porfiriana. So the Spanish term for it, I switched it to Pax because that term is also used less for the time period, but because it as a Latin thing, I was hoping it could inspire a whole Pax line of retooled Lords games. So Pax Spanish Main, Pax, whatever. That was the plan. I had my eyes set on Pax Renaissance. Lords of the Renaissance was another really interesting, clunky, bizarre game, penny related game.
Oh no! Don't bring the pennies back.
And so I certainly intended it to at least have the door open for a series. But as I mentioned, I did not expect success with Pax Porfiriana.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would just fill a void in the Sierra Madre of the game that year, whatever year you said it was. I don't remember what year.
Yeah. 2012 is what I got off of Board Game Geek.
They were looking for a game, so yeah, I was very excited when it succeeded, and certainly some of the clunkier financial mechanisms in that game inspired me or motivated me to reevaluate the finance systems in both Renaissance and Transhumanity. I'd always sort of hoped that the exact same market system with costs and cubes representing income would be translated en masse to the new PAX games, but that very quickly became impossible when we actually looked at any of the new PAX designs. It couldn't quite follow the same, and it wasn't super clean, and it still isn't very clean, trying to keep track of cubes and income and stuff like that. Little chits, little crappy tiddlywinks or whatever, trying to track your money and things. But hey, I'll take a tiddlywink over a penny any day of the week. Let me say that.
It's I feel like there are eras of Sierra Madre games components. To me the first standard component for Sierra Madre titles, like early ones, are tents. Like so many things have you cutting out a strip of cardboard and folding it, and then, or maybe around Porfiriana or maybe High Frontier, it turned into Tiddlywinks that were in everything. And I'll take Tiddlywinks over tents, but I'll side with you. I'll take either of those over pennies.
Great. I'm glad. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you skipped over the copper age or the zinc age or whatever these things are made of.
Looking back on Porfiriana, obviously it went on to sort of spawn this monster of a series for Sierra Madre. Do you look back at the game and think like, man, I would love to, do it a little differently or change something or do something beyond living rules, which we can talk about living rules in general in a minute. But as far as Porfiriana goes, do you feel like you missed the mark in some areas that you'd like another shot at?
Not sufficiently missed the mark that I would want to attempt to redesign the game. There's every project. Have I ever designed a game where I'm like, this is done, like super done? And the answer is no. And I sort of presume that's the truth for anyone who's sort of designing these projects, but it might also just be an outcome due to the large and complex nature of these, that there's going to be interactions that are unexpected and have to be addressed at a later time. I kind of hate living rules on like a fundamental level. However, the problem is that when you're making these complex interactions with numerous cards and lots of different potential ways that things can, go, and lots of different potential outcomes, and with really smart players out there who are figuring out ways to leverage things against each other in ways you never anticipated, I certainly understand their value. And even in, more recently on Transhumanity, it took almost no time at all for players to figure out how to improve the game. We always had scaling issues. I always, the original, when I sent it in, it had a certain scaling thing. You draw 36 cards plus 5 per player or something. I don't remember what it was exactly, but it was supposed to scale per player, but play testers, it was dragging or something like that. And so they got rid of some of these things. And I don't have a fundamental problem if scaling doesn't work out perfectly. If your 3-player game is really different than a 4-player game, then so what? I don't care too much about that. But there was Transhumanity. There's variants that people put up to make tycoon victories less likely in the 2-player game. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's a very welcome. I think that those should be added to the living rules because I think they fundamentally improve the game. The tycoon victory was added later in the process, not super well play tested, presumably not play tested enough in the 2-player variety. Otherwise, we should have spotted this issue. And so I don't, from that end, that's a welcome change. Good job, guys.
Okay, so that's a little surprising to hear that you're not really a fan of living rules, considering how common they are with Sierra Madre titles. Like I struggle right now to think of any Sierra Madre title that doesn't have a living rules document,
Yeah, if I haven't made it clear that I don't in any way control Sierra Madre games, then I have failed my job as an interviewee subject. So once upon a time, me and Phil were pretty close. We lived in the same town. We lived in the same house. We would go to dinner all the time, or we would be talking about these things. And then he moved to Germany. He retired from his job here, moved to Germany, and pursued his dream of being a game designer. And despite all of the technology or whatever, thousands of miles of distance has dramatically decreased our interactions and communications. And in no way have I ever been consulted, or it's extremely rare that I know what's happening with Sierra Madre games before people on Board Game Geek know. And it is not uncommon for me to learn that, a game I designed is being republished in French or Portuguese or whatever now, reprinted in Spanish before board game. I find out by going on Board Game Geek and being like, oh, that's a thing that's happening.
Oh, interesting.
So I am not Sierra Madre Games. I don't speak for Sierra Madre Games. And that would be Phil. So all of the living rules things, which have got to be just an epic pain trying to keep track of changes and accept changes and not accept changes and which ones are good and which ones are not, all in that period of time after designing a project when you're just exhausted with the whole thing and don't ever want to hear it ever again. That's got to be really hard. And so I'm very impressed with the efforts of Phil over the course of his entire design life to maintain living rules and to care about his projects enough not to just be like, do whatever's written in the thing. But on a fundamental level, I don't like the idea of us not sending people a box that tells you the accurate and correct way of how to play the game. Or the best way to play the game. I mean, that feels like a failure to some extent. But
yeah, I certainly know people that say, I don't care about living rules. I'm going to play the game with the rule book in the box and that's it. And yeah, ideally the included rule book in a game is sufficient to play it to a reasonable level that doesn't have some wild imbalance or some giant hole that you can't figure out, in the logic. So yeah. I certainly understand. I certainly understand that the mindset of the rules should be the rules. That living rules can be a pain, especially well after the fact. Like as I've been delving into some of the older Sierra Madre titles, seeking out the most up-to-date rules or the commonly accepted rule sets for fans of the game can be a huge pain. Some of the games change dramatically from the living rules to the written rules. Some barely change at all, but it can always be, especially now in web hosting. I know when I was when you had sent me Kriegbot and I was looking for rules for the expansion and they were in living rules somewhere. I ended up having to go to archive.org to find a file saved somewhere through them. And it can be unwieldy, certainly, but
now also, look, like Scott, Kriegbot we haven't supported the software for Kriegbot in 2 decades or whatever. I mean, this is we're not still no one buys Kriegbot anymore, Scott.
What I'm saying, Matt, is I am demanding a refund of my money here. I've been sold a half-finished product. No, it's. Yeah, the living rules. I feel like the living rules debate is going to be something that people online will talk about forever.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But a game that did have I'd hesitate to call it living rules, but it did have a rules update. Is your classic the venerable 2013 release Endzone.
Endzone, classic and venerable. These are, I think it might be up to 100 downloads now, Scott, would be my guess as to people who download that.
I am one of them, though I will say I have not yet played it. I do have the files, and I have printed them up.
Well, that's I am a American football fan, or I should say I became an American football fan in the exact way that you would expect a gamer to become an American football fan, which would be in 2005 when I was in law school and I got recruited to play in the law school fantasy football league.
Of course, fantasy football.
So I think most gamers who get into football got through via a game rather than via the sport itself, but maybe that's just speculation. But I really got into it. A friend of mine here in Tucson back then, a guy named Sean Siegel, provided input. Chris Peters, who I don't think I mentioned his name, but is an absolutely integral part of Sierra Madre's history, and is probably in the playtester list of every single Sierra Madre game since, I don't know what dates we're throwing back, but a long time ago. He was involved in that project because he liked football. And I also used to play Madden. I was a Madden player on the most elite of systems, the Nintendo Wii.
Oh, sure.
I was a relevant Madden 2009, I think, player. There was a time where I got obsessed with that game.
I think that was the one with Brett Favre on the cover.
Yeah, maybe that's a little eerie. That might be exactly right.
I will tell you the only reason I know that is because I'm a Green Bay Packers fan. So
there you go. Should have guessed. Wait, don't you live in Chicago?
I do.
Are you sure you're allowed to say that out loud, Scott?
I'm from Wisconsin. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I think so. I'm going to guess you're a Cardinals fan, but based on the fact that you came from fantasy football, I'm not sure. But I feel like most people are going to be fans of the team that they grew up around. I grew up around Brett Favre and the Green Bay Packers. Not that early of a childhood memory. I was 10, but a childhood memory of mine is the Packers winning the Super Bowl one year and then losing to the Broncos the next year. And people were mad about it. But I moved to Chicago, and I still wear a Packers hat when I go out. I still wave the Packers flag. I've made some enemies, but that's fine. You know what, Matt? That's life. Sometimes you make enemies. But I always defend the Packers are the only publicly owned major league sports team in the country. The city of Green Bay owns them, and they provide for the city of Green Bay, and you cannot say that that's a bad thing.
That is intense. I did not know that.
Yeah, they don't have a single owner. The owner is the city of Green Bay, and they issue shares now and again that people can buy.
The way they do in soccer is I think
that's about right. Yeah, but in football and in American sports, they are the only major sports team that does that. But awesome. In any event. Before I guess talk about End Zone, which I would like to. I have to know though, because you came in from fantasy football. You live in a state that has a football team, the Arizona Cardinals. Because you came in from fantasy. Team, yeah. Because you came in from fantasy, were you a fan of a team that you had like a star player from, or that you had multiple like star players from, or are you a Cardinals fan?
I'm a Cardinals fan. However, have there been years when I've been really rooting for the Chargers or the Colts or the fill in the blank? Yeah, that certainly happened. Or years where I've held my nose and rooted for the Patriots to lose their game, but to score a lot of points doing so. Yeah. Yes, that's definitely happened.
Yeah, I also play fantasy. I understand the plight of I want the Packers to win, but not by that much. Mindset.
Yeah, I'm definitely loyal enough that I care more about the Cardinals winning a game, even in a wasted season, than I would about fantasy on a given thing. But this is something, I still play, I was recruited in law school. I still play in that league, even though everyone's gone all their separate ways and whatever, like that's every year. That is something I look forward to, and brings me solace to know that football, season is coming, and you find strength in those little things. But
rest in peace to the planned interim of the XFL, once again dead.
Yeah, well, yeah. Or fill in the blank on whatever, every attempt to fill that void has failed. But
well, Matt, you were attempting to fill a void in a quality football board game with End Zone, and
that's right.
Tell me about it. Tell me about End Zone.
Well, the main thing is that when you're playing competitive Madden, you realize that your play calls and your different like reads and your different defensive lineaments are far more important than you would think in a game. Certainly before I started playing Madden, I was aware of sports video games. I'd certainly played sports video games, but I wasn't aware of how the sort of higher end strategy, the sort of zoomed out strategy that has a lot more effect on the game than you think it would, and does not involve pressing a certain button at the exact time, hand-eye coordination, dexterity, and stuff.
It's a strategy game.
Right. It is. In many ways, it is a strategy game, and there's a lot of execution in there, but there's a lot of strategy in there. And so I wanted to make a game that would emulate that. And the first thing I did was go look for a game that emulated that. And I tried a bunch of different games, pizza, box, football, and some others. And I didn't find anything that was even close to what I was looking for. I mean, there was some like hardcore simulation stuff. But I wanted something that was fast. I needed something faster that was more zoomed out, that was more, head faking and mind games. And so really my Madden experience, which like I said was not very long, maybe a year long before I got angry and gave the whole thing up, but gave me a lot of sort of general knowledge about how these things work, and I was able to apply that and to create an abstract card game that was based on it. It's zoomed out. It uses field position and things like that, rather than counting individual yards and individual player locations and things like that. You have two players who are plotting particular plays. However, there's some of that mental games ahead of time because there's cards that you can play that will affect your sets or affect your personnel ahead of time. It's a very simple game. You plot. Each side plots a card, you flip it up, and then one card will tell you which edge of the opposing card to compare it to. And then you literally slide those cards together, and it gives you a little chart. And you roll on the chart, and you see what happens. And then there's various special cards that can affect different things. It's really a pretty fundamentally simple game, but one that I knew had no hope in the Sierra Madre game lineup. And I'm not a marketer. I certainly at that time was not a confident game designer who could just go out to some random company somewhere and be like, hey, come publish my game. But I thought that maybe someone would like it, so I added some fonts or whatever and typed up the rules, which are like 2 pages long or something, and put it out there in the universe. And as a print and play on Board Game Geek. And there were several people who mentioned interest in trying to make off-season rules or things like that. Nothing's ever particularly come of it. But it's literally, I made fun of McDraw in 1997 or something earlier in our conversation. But this is elite Matt Eklund graphic design here. This is like an X is bad and a dot is not good, and
I want to say I think on Board Game Geek you might have called it Hunchback Ugly.
That sounds like me. I will say that sounds like me, Scott. I don't remember saying that, but that sounds like me.
Yeah. When I was going like through your catalog a while ago to see what else you would put out, because I'm a fan of your games, Matt. I think you make some of the best stuff that's come out of Sierra Madre, even if you are not officially part of the company. The games that you're involved with that have come out through them, by and large, have been my favorite ones from that company. And so when I saw that you put out a football game called End Zone, that seemed like I had to like do a double take, because I was like, is that right? You put out a game like about revolutionary Mexico, and then later the like giant scope of the Renaissance, and then a futurist game and all this stuff, and then a football game that seemed so off brand. But what you're telling me, like it sounds like your interests, your believe it or not, your interests seemed varied and not one dimensional. So I guess it's cool that you kind of harnessed what would sort of be a strange thing compared to the rest of your catalog and turned it into a kind of neat little football game.
Well, thank you, Scott. That's very kind to say. I'm confident that End Zone will never see the light of day in any meaningful way, but it's another design that I do look back on warmly. I feel like there was some cleverness in those interactions, and that maybe someone somewhere will get some play out of it.
Yeah, it very much seems like a pretty well-formed idea from looking at the rules, and I've set it up and kind of, played around with it a bit. It seems like something that was sort of in development, maybe not like hardcore in development, but something you were sort of working on and put out what you had. It feels like something that could be returned to at some point. But you don't think that you will?
No, I don't think I will, but I mean, that's for a lot of reasons, but I have a competitive advantage, Scott, in designing certain types of games. A football card game, a light football card game is not one of those.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, after End Zone, I guess something very similar to a light football card game was another card game, Pax Renaissance.
Super similar.
Yeah, it's basically End Zone second edition, as far as I can tell. Pax Renaissance is, I think, in a lot of ways if High Frontier is like the peak of the mountain for complex Sierra Madre releases, Pax Renaissance is like right at its heels. Pax Renaissance is a beast. Like it is shocking to me still that it's in such a small box, given the fact that it has all this scope and scale and systems involved in it. And the production of the game seemed, you had written a couple of designer diaries about Pax Renaissance. It seemed like quite the development of that game. I think you had said in a diary that it went through like 9 revisions or something like that, like 9 major revisions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. What's your recollection about like deciding to, like, this is the next game that's going to get created?
Yeah, it was brutal. So Pax Renaissance. I always wanted Pax Renaissance to be the second Pax game that was going to be published. Lords of the Renaissance was the most successful Lords game other than Lords of the Sierra Madre. Thought, hey, here we're going to Pax Renaissance. It's an interesting time period, and I built a design for that game, and it involved a very significant map with all the cities and city-states, and it looked like maybe a Here I Stand or something similar map of Europe and Turkey and Northern Africa. I built a game that had a power structure track that would compare the relative military strengths of the different empires, that involved loan cards and conspiracy cards and all sorts of mechanisms to build this game. And it turns out at the exact same time, Phil was designing his own Pax Renaissance that was entirely different and focused on a very different question, which had to do with classes. It had to do with class structure in the Renaissance and the undermining of the traditional medieval way of thinking. And so these two designs were both terrible, and they were both awful. And we playable, but not good in any way. And if I remember correctly, he had already moved to Germany by this time. And so we are firing shots from afar at each other with, here's the map and here's the new rules, and have you actually even tried this thing and whatever. And meanwhile, I'm doing play tests on my end and he's doing play tests on his end, and et cetera. And the two designs crashed into each other. And Phil's design was ultimately superior. I mean, it was ultimately better and better focused, and certainly had a better theme. I mean, the idea that the game should be about the competing classes, or that the players should compete on different levels based on classes rather than just trying to get an empire, make it as strong as possible, and make as much money as possible, or whatever, was crucial and critically important. And so eventually we came to the conclusion, we started bouncing it back and forth between us. But it was grueling, and it was really painful. We would I said 9 or whatever, but I'm sure it was more. But 7 disappeared in its entirety. It's possible that 5 and 9 look more similar to each other than 7, and 7 was just a total false start that never. It wasn't this nice, clean progression of it's monkey turns into ape carrying a stick, turns into guy standing upright typing on a computer.
Sure.
It was just random species thrown into the mix, and some of them getting clubbed by other ones, and it was not a nice, clean progression to the mountaintop. And there was a period, and I wrote it in the diary, and I don't remember the timeline, but some period where Phil came to Tucson. He came to Tucson and visited. And once again, with Chris Peters, our play tester extraordinaire, and an individual who's uniquely experienced at maintaining the balance between me and Phil. We played like every night. I put my kids to bed, and we would stay up late yelling at each other about this aspect or that aspect or whatever. And even when he left, the card roster hadn't been finalized. We had completely redone the map idea. We'd broken up all the cards to move them apart from each other so that you could play in the space between the cards. We had huge redesigns, but eventually it got passed back and forth enough, and it really once again, there's another project where I wasn't sure about it when it went out. I wasn't sure if people would be able to get it. It's really obtuse. It's really hard to pick up Pax Renaissance and be like, okay, how do I improve my situation? I have a turn. I have actions. Mm-hmm. How do I make my world better? And it's like, well,
yeah, it's and it's quite the shift from like Porfiriana has sort of a relatively tight focus on like kind of what you're trying to do and the way money flows around, and then Cole Worley's Pamir was also, like, a lot of people for a while said that was the best entry point into the Pax series because it's a little more clear on like how you're moving stuff around and what you're doing. And then suddenly Pax Renaissance is like, what if it had every system that it could have? And what if every icon that we can think of is being used here? And what if every piece had like 3 positions it could be in? It's like, it's insane. It's such a densely packed and designed game. But like High Frontier, it somehow works. It somehow all comes together and coalesces into this like honestly brilliant design. I think it is, I would call one of my favorite games. And I think a lot of people agree. I know there's a guy that I talk to somewhat regularly who owns like 4 copies of it, and he's made his custom versions of it, and has like, he's just is obsessed with Pax Renaissance. And I don't think he's alone. I think whatever you ultimately put out definitely struck a chord with the right people.
Me and Phil were able to agree on certain like fundamental principles, like ideas from the era that just had to go in. Like they just have to go in. Certainly money being tied to military, trade routes being tied to military generation, repression of certain classes resulting in instability within a particular empire. These were all really important in the time period, and were ways for us to bridge certain gaps. But as I've mentioned, it was Phil, not me, who came up with hey, we need to be talking about the classes, all the chess piece stuff, which is awesome in that game. Mm-hmm. All of that came from Phil's design, not from mine. And the repression mechanic and things like that are all inherent to Phil's design. So as much as Pax Porfiriana, I like to take credit for that one. Phil should take credit for Renaissance, because huge amounts of work went into that project. I guarantee that Phil would say that he gave up on that project at some point. That there was a point in time where he's like, "This is done. It's doomed. It's over."
Wow.
And I know I did. And those are situations where we would just bat it back and forth. I give up. Here you go. Take it back. Take all the files back. Here you go. See what you can do. like see what happens. And it took so long. I mean, it took so long that Phil and Cole made a completely different PAX game in the meantime. I mean, it's incredible. It's amazing how long PAX Renaissance took. It was brutal.
So yeah, well, yeah, I was going to briefly mention Pamir. So you said that you wanted Renaissance to be the second PAX game, but it wasn't. It was the third PAX game. How much was Renaissance design altered by the design and release of Pamir?
That's a good question. I was not intimately involved in Pamir. I did do some play testing and I did provide some input. However, Phil was presumably very involved. And I think I mentioned this in the diary, but Pamir solved some really important problems that have to do with maps and geographical space as relative to cards that are dissociated from those pieces. So in Renaissance, you don't control pieces per se. In Pamir, that's sort of where that idea sort of comes from and is born. I was not involved in the Pamir development. I was rooting for the project from afar. I thought it was a really cool time period and interesting thematically. But I wasn't. That wasn't mine. And like I said, all that got done without. All in the time period while Renaissance was, burning under some bridge somewhere in a garbage fire as we were hammering away on it. Honestly, I'm sure Cole can take some credit for some of the Renaissance mechanics. Certainly, some of the ones that are map based. Him and Phil, whichever one I don't know whichever one of them sorted that stuff out, was really important when we saw that those things could work in a PAX game. It was a lot easier to adopt them into the Renaissance game. Even though we had to abstract a lot of stuff out.
So Porfiriana sort of has a map. Like there are a few locations where, certain cards affect things in certain locations, but it's not like a physical map that you're moving stuff around on.
Right.
Was there a version of Renaissance early on that like used a similar sort of like pseudo map system, and it was like suddenly it was, oh, hey, we're going to do the map this way? Like was there an early version of that game that is using is closer to Porfiriana?
I would say probably. I remember one of the early sort of map ideas that Phil had you playing on edges of cards that were adjacent to each other. So that's still a map, which is above and beyond what Porfiriana had. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'd say not exactly would be my answer, but the idea that you have pieces in play, that are not associated to individual players, and that instead represent interests, and you use card abilities to represent your ability to actually affect map play. That's directly related to Pamir, right? Pamir is an entire game built about using cards to affect map play.
Yeah.
To leverage abilities and leverage locations to map play.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think you can see the lineage from Pamir to Renaissance, or the influence, I should say, from Pamir to Renaissance pretty clearly.
Yeah, I agree with all that. That part of it didn't go through me, so it's hard for me to comment.
Sure. Well, what about the second edition of Pax Renaissance that it just got funded on Kickstarter. You Board Game Geek does give you a credit for that. Is that like a legacy credit because you had it from the original game, or do you have active involvement in the second edition?
I do not have active involvement in the second edition, so I guess a legacy credit might be the right choice there. But my understanding is the game hasn't really dramatically changed. The one thing is that there are certain things that just the original components in the game gave us limitations. So one of those was the third state, which we had to make cuts. Like there were discussions about, hey, we have an empire. It has two potential states. It can only have one theocracy on it. Which theocracy? And that's not
Sure.
not an obvious. It's not an obvious answer based on the history. I mean, it could have gone this way or that way. Like, if Hungary falls, if Vienna is successfully sieged, it looks a lot different, but simultaneously it could have just as easily been swept up in the Reformation along with the Holy Roman Empire. I'm glad, I'm heartened to see that Sierra Madre doesn't have to make those cuts based solely on components anymore. The way we did with every other project since the beginning of time, where we killed off ideas or cards or mechanisms solely because the components wouldn't fit them.
There was such like a crunch in like box size for Sierra Madre for a while.
There was an actual, like, I don't know, 500 grams. There was this like deadline where we had to measure like every little thing to make it fit the thing or whatever. But all that experience of making players bring their own pennies to games and all that stuff, tiddlywinks, what have you, makes Sierra Madre games uniquely suited to giving you a dense and compact product. With every component having a really important purpose, because that was contributing against our 500 gram weight limit or whatever it was.
Yeah. I think PAX Renaissance, but the PAX series in general, but I think Renaissance maybe especially is sort of the king of like gameplay to box size ratio. It's like such a tiny, unassuming box, and there's so much in there. And that's the case with Porfiriana and Transhumanity and really a lot of Sierra Madre stuff. It's always impressive what gets done with such a small footprint, at least in terms of box size. Once it's on the table, maybe it takes up a bit of space, but certainly impressive stuff there. All right, well, that is going to do it for this part of the interview with Matt Eklund. In the next part, we get into Pax Transhumanity. And that's basically it. We talk about that game for quite a bit, so be sure to look out for it and check it out when it's available. If you enjoy Phasing Player stuff, by all means, consider a donation. Go to phasingplayer.com/donate for a handful of options. And of course, as always, thank you very much to everyone that has donated, either through PayPal with one-time donations or a recurring thing on Patreon. I appreciate every penny that anyone gives me, and it really helps me continue to make content for this channel to bring you guys. So anyway, until the next video or the next audio bit, stay healthy, stay cool. I will talk to everyone another time.